Again, talking to David Zetland about his new book, Living with Water Scarcity. David, one of the key issues that you discuss in the book is agriculture. Now, agriculture is one of the largest users of water, around about 70 to 80% of water use in most countries. And some people argue that agricultural water is underpriced and it can be inefficiently used. So my question is, do farmers waste water, or does cheap water keep us from starvation, effectively?
Yeah. So let's take care of the easy question. Does cheap water keep us from starvation? No. That's because the price of water is one of the inputs of many inputs, including the farmer's labor, the capital, the land, the seeds, the fertilizers, and so on. So the water is one of many inputs into food. And that's raw material as food, so maybe a tomato or maybe a stalk of corn. Then the food is going to be processed, potentially. It's going to be packaged. It's going to be shipped. It's going to be delivered. It's going to be put in through a wholesale network to a retail distribution, so it's going to get to your supermarket, typically. Most people don't buy food from farmers and farmers markets. So the contribution of the price of water to that final price that the consumer pays on the shelf for a box of cereal is almost nothing. For a tomato or a watermelon or some other direct fruit or veg, I think the contribution of the price of water might be at most 10%. So cheap water doesn't mean cheap food as far as most consumers are concerned. More interestingly, cheap water does mean more water used. And that's because farmers will say, hey, I've got a lot of water here. That means I don't have to use more labor. I'll just dump the water on the ground and the plants will find as much as they need. If water is very expensive, farmers will say, wow, I should put in maybe drip irrigation, or maybe I should have more laborers directing the water to the plants. And they'll spend more money on the capital expenditure of building an irrigation, a pressurized drip irrigation system, or they'll spend more money on labor to get workers to labor the plants more carefully, for example. So farmers will substitute cheap water for other inputs, and they'll do that because it's economical and profitable. The bigger question is there enough water to go around to allow that to happen? Which is where,
and is there enough water to go around for that to
happen? Yes, sometimes there is. Notoriously, the rice farmers of both Australia and the United States, and of course Southeast Asia and South Asia, rice farmers count on floods and monsoons to bring way too much water, and they divert some of it and they grow rice. On the other hand, there's places that are in drought, and farmers have traditional rights to water, and they're using that water, and they're going to grow, say, in California, almonds, and they're going to put the almonds on the ship, and they're going to send it to China or to Europe or wherever, Australia, to be eaten. And that's California water that's leaving the state, and it's not being used, for example, in the rivers of California to keep the fish alive, or in the taps of California to help people in Los Angeles drink water, or to water their lawns. So then you have, should we grow almonds or should we water lawns? This ends up being a much more theological question. So there is a cost of farmers using a lot of water in drought. The question really is, why should they use less when it's their water, when they have the right to that water? And that ends up being a big policy discussion, which is, it's worth getting into, but you can't automatically accuse them of wasting the water that's already theirs.
And in terms of the rights to water, there are different systems in different parts of the world. And in Australia, it's quite well known that we have a system of trading in place. What do you think is, and then also there are also situations where farmers can have a right to water because they were there first,
right,
effectively.
Yep.
So what do you think is the best way in this day and age to allocate water to farmers and to other users?
I think in most places where there's literally some competition for the water, whether it's between farmers and the environment or farmers and cities, it's good to have some version of a cap and trade, in the sense that You should cap the amount of water being used by all human activities or by the agricultural sector, and then trade, allowing farmers to trade. So that's more or less how Australia's system works. The key components to this are measuring the amount of water there is and limiting the amount being used. So in many parts of the world, for example, in Spain and in France and the United States, in the West, groundwater, and China, groundwater is neither measured nor regulated in terms of total consumption. What that means is the water is being mined. Mined water is not going to be there tomorrow. It's not a renewable resource. It's a non-renewable resource like coal. And when you mine your groundwater, you can use that to grow food today, for example, or cotton or something like that. But you won't be able to do that tomorrow, and that can be an issue in terms of sustainability for the agricultural community. That problem can be addressed by limiting the total amount that's being taken out of the ground, which means you have to measure how much is being taken out of the ground. And many farmers oppose that because they consider it's their right to take water from under their land. The same thing is a problem with diversion of water out of rivers, which is what you mentioned. Traditional water rights are called first in time, first in right. And if I was taking out 20 minor inches, or which is a measurement unit, like how many inches of water a miner would use 150 years ago, or I'm taking 12 acre feet, or whatever it is I'm taking, that type of right often doesn't recognize the fact that there's more or less water in the river. So it's not actually very good from a hydrological perspective to continue to enforce those rights. So what Australia has done, which I think is a world-leading example, is to often, number one, change rights into licenses, which means that the licenses can be revoked or modified. And I might get this wrong, so you can correct me, but they have the licenses, and the licenses will allocate a certain amount of water each year to each license. And what that means is that if there's a lot of rain, a lot of water, then the farmers get 100% of the water that is attributed to their license. And if there's not as much, they don't have as much. Then the water they get allocated, they can use themselves, or they can sell. They can trade it with each other. And what that means is that you don't really need to talk about farmers wasting water. What the farmer will say is, can I use this water on my property right here to grow rice or wheat or apples? It doesn't matter, whatever crop I want to grow. Or should I sell it to another farmer who will give me money, and maybe they've got a better use for it? So that allows the water to go to the best use in terms of the agricultural sector without depleting the environment, because of that, the licenses being allocated according to how much water there is. Period.
That was a very good description. One other question I wanted to follow up on from something you said before is, you mentioned the idea of water that's embedded in California's trade overseas. And I think a lot of people would be familiar with the idea of the water footprint. Mm-hmm. This is a very difficult issue because obviously there are external social costs for the places in which the goods are produced. So from a policy perspective, how could you deal with this idea of exporting embedded water in particular products? Would you say, for example, impose some sort of border tax or some sort of levy?
Well, no, I wouldn't. If I was going to get into this, so water footprinting and embedded water are related ideas, but they're not the same idea. And they're, without going down the road of what water footprint people think about how to handle this, it's some version of a measurement and an accounting and a deficit and a surplus, and you owe us water or whatever. I don't like the way that they talk about it. What I would say is this: if you're going to use water locally for agriculture, then you should allow that water to be used. If the products of agriculture are going to be used domestically or they're going to be exported, that should be also normal, natural. And what that will, and then countries that are importing those products will be doing so because the cost of local production for them is higher in many ways, whether it's labor or water or land or whatever. but they're willing to buy the food from you or the production from you. So to use an example, Saudi Arabia. I was just in Saudi Arabia. They have very, very, very little water. The little water they have, they're mining like crazy, so they're going to run out very quickly. They need to import their food. And Australia, for example, although it has problems with drought, it has a big agricultural sector, it has the opportunity to export food sustainably. And in Saudi Arabia, let's say it would cost, I don't know, say $10 a kilo to grow wheat. And say it would cost $3 a kilo to grow wheat in Australia. And both of those numbers reflect sustainable water use. Let's just use that idea. Then why wouldn't it be okay for Australian farmers to sell wheat to Saudi Arabia? There's two reasons. One is that the price of wheat in Australia would go up. So Australian consumers would, instead of paying $3 a kilo, they would pay $4 a kilo. The other one is that the Australian water would be leaving the continent to go somewhere else. And that would make some people upset, especially people who want to use that water for themselves in Australia. They don't want that water to go abroad. So you're getting more or less into a political decision called, should we trade with other countries? And that has a very long history. And I'm an economist, I'm a free trading economist, and I think that if the food is being produced sustainably in the sense of using the correct amount of water, not overdrafting the water, for example, then the food should be exported to other countries, and those other countries should import it, and they should pay the cost of doing that, and the profit should go back to the farmers. And, for example, if the Australian government is going to charge farmers for using the resource which belongs to the people, there's a surcharge, a royalty tax on that resource, then the Australian government can collect the tax from the farmers regardless of where that food ends up going. So you can square the circle on sustainable and fiscal and political. The idea really is to make sure that the food is being grown where there's enough water and not being grown where there's not very much water.